Evidence that some drug manufacturers may be putting profits before safety. The Huffington Post details the case of NuvaRing, a popular hormonal contraceptive introduced back in 2001. It was heralded as a major advancement in birth control at the time, but in the years since, a growing number of women have come forward with allegations that it caused blood clots and other severe side effects. Now 1,500 women are suing in a mass litigation federal court. They claim the drug makers not only knew about the risk, but lobbied the FDA to soften the warning label. NuvaRing's manufacturer Merck disputed the claim that the company misled consumers about the drug side effects, telling the Huffington Post, quote, "The company has provided appropriate and timely information about NuvaRing to consumers and the medical, scientific, and regulatory communities, but we remain confident in the safety and efficacy profile of which is supported by extensive scientific research, and we will continue to always act in the best interest of the patient." In this case, we're talking about birth control, but it raises bigger questions about the FDA's relationship with Big Pharma and behind-the-scenes tug-of-war between safety and sales. Joining us now is Sabrina Siddiqui, the Huffington Post reporter who wrote the story. And Sabrina, it's great to have you here. It isn't just NuvaRing, right? I mean, this is something that many women need to know about.
Yes, absolutely. This is a common process, as you mentioned, these negotiations over what a drug label will look like. And sometimes safety is put aside because you have drug companies that try to argue with the FDA and say that conclusions from clinical trials were not accurate. With respect to NuvaRing, it's true that all hormonal contraceptives carry some risk of blood clot, but multiple studies have associated the ring with a higher risk that has not been reflected in the warning information over now the course of a decade. Now, it is disconcerting that both the FDA and the original manufacturer knew about this before NuvaRing was approved for the market, and that leaving out that critical warning information from the label has proved critical to thousands of women who have suffered from blood clots. Sometimes they have been fatal, and it does call into question the ability of drug companies to use their influence in the safety process under the FDA when it comes to the approval of drugs and medical devices.
I think a lot of people look at the FDA as our sort of advocate in all this. If it passes the FDA, it's got the good housekeeping seal of approval sort of thing. So they're supposed to be protecting consumers and policing Big Pharma on our behalf. Do you think that the FDA is doing enough for consumers?
No, it's not doing enough for consumers, especially since it was created for the consumer. In terms of FDA regulation, they have been given more authority by Congress to impose label changes when safety information becomes available after a drug is brought onto the market. Previously, it was a voluntary action on the part of a drug company to update its label. But with NuvaRing, since 2000, Congress gave the FDA the authority to unilaterally impose a label change, and they have failed to do so, despite the evidence that has emerged about the risk of blood clots that is greater, of course, as I mentioned before, when compared to other hormonal contraceptives. In addition to that, they often convene so-called independent advisory committees to assess drug safety, and especially when it comes to voting on label changes. And many times it's been found that those so-called independent advisors have direct financial ties to drug companies. Again, it's a question of conflicts of interest, and are these independent advisors then putting the public before profit?
Well, it certainly wouldn't be the first time that an agency got too close to the industry that it was supposed to be regulating and policing. Another practice, though, that has been widely criticized, that is common within the big pharmaceutical industry, is paying doctors to promote their products. And one large pharmaceutical maker, GlaxoSmithKline, recently announced that they're going to stop that practice. They're going to stop paying doctors to promote their prescription products. And that was as a result of some increased transparency within the Affordable Care Act. Is the Affordable Care Act doing anything else to sort of shift and clean up the relationship between the FDA and Big Pharma?
Well, that change that you mentioned is perhaps the most critical change under the Affordable Care Act that kind of gets at that relationship. So under that change, pharmaceutical companies will be required to disclose payments that they make to physicians for consulting fees as well as promotion. That data collection actually began and kicked in last August. And in September of this year, CMS will create a website where it will disclose all of those financial contributions between drug companies and physicians. So that is a major step. And as you mentioned, GlaxoSmithKline is one company that has now decided just to stop paying doctors altogether to promote their drugs. Other companies might be weighing a similar decision. in light of the fact that this information will now be public. In terms of the actual FDA's role and the FDA authority, there haven't been any significant changes to that other than the Amendments Act that I mentioned from 2007. And again, there continues to be this problem where the FDA still hasn't actually used its authority because about 70% of the FDA's funding comes from user fees from these pharmaceutical companies. So that's another process that tilts the balance in favor of drug companies because it's also a very underfunded body. So that's something that Congress would have to address if they were able to try and move the FDA in a more independent direction where it's not completely dependent on the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, I mean, but let's take a step back and look at this more from the consumer perspective, straight up, even if you don't know exactly how the FDA works. You know, when people see political ads and the politician says, I approve this message, a lot of people are like, that's weird, whatever, politics is weird. Actually, they are forced by federal law to say that, right? Walk us through why a consumer would want these rules that force these companies at the end of those commercials to tell us a little bit more and tell us on the packaging.
Well, it's important because often not only do patients not know, but prescribing doctors, while they are aware of most of the risks that are associated with these drugs, they kind of make a decision that's more based on efficacy, especially because extremely adverse side effects are rare. So the blood clots that are associated with NuvaRing also are rare. And what the issue is here is that the manufacturer NuvaRing has been masking, I think, the elevated risk of the blood clots and only mentions in a quick second in their advertising that that risk is there. And women just have said that they don't know about it.
Yeah, and this is so important for women to know more about. Sabrina Siddiqui, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And up next, everything you need to know about economics explained through online dating.